The city outside the car window was a blur of gray and muted gold, a world rushing by at a speed that had long since ceased to impress the man in the back seat. Kane rested his head against the cool glass, his reflection a ghostly double of the powerful billionaire everyone saw. His suit was worth more than most people's cars. His watch could pay off a mortgage, and his name opened doors that were permanently sealed to others. Yet inside the silent, leather-scented interior of the luxury sedan, he felt a familiar, hollow ache. It was the quiet that did it, the space between one responsibility and the next where the loneliness crept in. His bodyguard David, a man built like a fortress, with a face etched with quiet loyalty, sat in the front passenger seat. David had been with him for 5 years, a steadfast presence who asked no questions and offered no unnecessary conversation. He was a good man, and Kane, in his own detached way, trusted him. That was why, when David had hesitantly asked if he could briefly stop by his apartment to check on his daughter before they headed to the estate, Kane had simply nodded. It was a small detour, an insignificant blip in his meticulously planned day. The car pulled up to a modest but clean apartment building, a world away from the steel and glass towers Kane inhabited. David got out, promising to be quick. Through the tinted window, Kane watched him disappear inside. He expected to wait, to return to the reports on his tablet. But moments later, David re-emerged, and with him was a young woman. She was different. She wasn't dressed in the sharp, expensive outfits of the women he usually encountered. She wore simple, comfortable clothes, and her hair fell in soft, natural waves around her shoulders. But it was her face that held his attention. There was a light in her eyes, a warmth and openness that was entirely unfamiliar to him. She laughed at something her father said, and the sound, even muffled by the car door, was like a sudden, clear note in his silent world. She carried a bag of groceries, and she moved with a grace that wasn't practiced or posed, but simply her. Her name, he would learn, was Serena. A strange, unfamiliar impulse seized him. Instead of looking away, he watched her. He saw the easy affection between father and daughter, a simple dynamic he had never known. He saw the way she looked at her surroundings, not with ambition or avarice, but with a quiet contentment. For a fleeting second, Kane felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Not jealousy, but a deep, yearning curiosity. Then, the moment passed. David gave his daughter a hug and got back in the car. As they pulled away, Kane found his eyes lingering on Serena's figure in the rearview mirror until she was out of sight. Days turned into a week. The memory of the girl with the warm eyes should have faded, replaced by board meetings and acquisition deals. But it didn't. It lingered in the back of his mind, a persistent, quiet hum. It was during a security briefing about a rival company playing dirty, making threats, that the memory crystallized into a cold, hard plan. The report stated that adversaries, when they couldn't reach him, often targeted those close to his inner circle. His mind, sharp and ruthless, made the connection instantly. David was his inner circle, and David had a daughter. He summoned David to his office, a vast room with a view of the city that made everyone who entered feel small. David stood before the massive desk, his posture rigid. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Kane didn't mince words. "The Andrick situation is escalating. Their tactics are personal." He steepled his fingers. "They will look for leverage. They will look for your weakness." David's brow furrowed. "I understand, sir. My security protocols are—" "Your daughter," Kane interrupted, his voice flat and final. "She is the vulnerability." David's confident mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing pure paternal fear. "Serena, she has nothing to do with this." "To them, she has everything to do with it," Kane stated, a part of him noting the name. Serena, it suited her. "To ensure her safety and, by extension, the integrity of my security, she will relocate here, to the estate, immediately." The color drained from David's face. "Sir, with all due respect, she has her own life, her job, her friends. I can't ask her to give that up." "You aren't asking," Kane said, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was the voice he used to close billion-dollar deals, a voice that brooked no dissent. I am telling you, this is not a negotiation. Her safety is now my priority. She will be brought here tonight. That evening, the grand foyer of Kane's estate felt more like a prison intake area. Serena stood beside her father, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked small and out of place against the marble floors and the sweeping staircase. Her eyes, which Kane had remembered as warm, were now wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. Kane descended the stairs slowly, his every footstep echoing in the cavernous space. He had changed into a dark sweater and trousers, looking less like a corporate titan and more like a king in his castle. He stopped in front of them, his gaze sweeping over Serena before settling on David. The East Wing guest suite has been prepared, Kane said, his voice cool. It has its own security system. She is not to leave the grounds unescorted. Serena found her voice, a tremor of anger in it. You can't just keep me here. This is kidnapping. Kane finally turned his full attention to her. Up close, she was even more striking. The defiance in her eyes was a spark in his otherwise sterile world. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. He was so much taller, his presence overwhelming. He could see her trying hard not to shrink back. This is protection, he corrected her, his voice low and dangerously calm. You are a liability. Your father's focus must be on his job, not on worrying about you. Your presence here ensures that. My life is back in the city, she insisted, her voice shaking. Your old life is a risk I am no longer willing to tolerate, he replied, his eyes locked on hers. The air grew thick with tension. David looked down, his face a mask of helpless guilt. Kane leaned in, just a little, his voice dropping to a near whisper meant only for her. The words were deliberate, chosen to shatter her resistance, to establish absolute control. You don't seem to understand the situation you're in. This isn't a discussion. You will live here. You will follow my rules. You will accept my protection. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into her very bones. You'll take every inch of it. You'll take every inch of the safety I provide, every inch of the walls of this house, every inch of my control over your life, until the threat is gone. You'll take it until you can't even remember what it was like to walk away. Do you understand me? The words hung in the air, cruel and final. Serena stared at him, her lips parted in shock, her brave defiance crumbling into sheer, helpless terror. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She was trapped. The man before her wasn't just rich. He was a force of nature, and he had just declared her his prisoner. Kane held her gaze for a long moment, seeing the fight drain out of her. He had won. He had secured the asset, neutralized the risk. He should have felt satisfaction. But as he looked at the tear on her cheek, all he felt was that familiar, hollow ache, now sharper and more profound than ever. He had gotten what he wanted, but the silence in his vast, empty house suddenly felt louder. He turned and walked away, leaving Serena standing alone in the glittering foyer. The echo of his promise, or his threat, closing in around her like the walls of a beautifully crafted cage. The days that followed Kane's decree bled into one another, forming a monotonous tapestry of isolation for Serena. The East Wing guest suite was, by any standard, opulent. It was a symphony of silk, marble, and curated art. A space that spoke of immense wealth but offered no comfort. To Serena, it was a gilded cage. The king-size bed was too large. The silence too profound. The view of the manicured gardens a constant reminder of the world from which she was barred. She was a songbird trapped in a crystal box, able to see the sky, but utterly unable to touch it. Her initial defiance had been a fierce, burning thing. She had tested the boundaries, trying to walk to the estate's gates, only to be politely but firmly intercepted by a member of Kane's security team, their faces as impassive as stone sentinels. She had refused meals, only to have them replaced with new, equally elaborate ones. Her anger was a fire with no fuel, sputtering against the immovable object of Kane's will. The fight slowly ebbed, replaced by a deep, gnawing loneliness. She missed the sound of her neighbor's laughter through the walls, the smell of coffee from the shop downstairs, the simple, unplanned chaos of her own life. Kane, for his part, was a ghost in his own home. He was a presence felt rather than seen, the low rumble of his car engine arriving late at night, the soft click of his study door closing, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the hallways. He was a fortress unto himself, and Serena was merely a resident of the Outer Bailey, a problem he had contained and seemingly forgotten. He buried himself in work, the glow of his computer screen a constant companion in the midnight hours. Yet the memory of her, the flash of defiance in her eyes, the single tear on her cheek, would intrude at the most inopportune moments. He found himself wondering what she was doing, if she was still angry, if the silence of his house was as heavy for her as it was for him. The first crack in the ice appeared on a night of crashing thunder and slashing rain. The storm had rolled in with a vengeance, shaking the very foundations of the estate. Serena, who had always been secretly afraid of thunderstorms, found herself unable to sleep. The grand suite felt cavernous and threatening, every creak of the old house magnified by the howling wind. Driven by a need for something solid and mundane, she ventured downstairs to the kitchen, a massive, professional space that was usually spotless and empty. She was standing by the massive stainless steel refrigerator, bathed in its cool light, when a voice cut through the darkness. "Can't sleep?" She jumped, spinning around. Kane was leaning against the doorframe, shrouded in shadow. He was dressed in a simple black t-shirt and dark trousers, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man, tired and real. "The storm," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her hand pressed to her racing heart. He moved into the kitchen, his movements quiet and fluid. He didn't look at her, instead focusing on filling a kettle at the sink. "It's just noise," and he stated, but his voice lacked its usual edge. "It's loud noise," she countered, a sliver of her old spirit returning. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He set the kettle on the stove. "Tea?" he offered. It wasn't a command. It was a question. That simple, unexpected question changed the atmosphere in the room. The dynamic of jailer and prisoner momentarily dissolved, replaced by two people sharing a space in the middle of a stormy night. He made tea, not with the practiced ease of a servant, but with the quiet concentration of a man doing something he rarely did. She sat at the large kitchen island, watching him, seeing the way his shoulders were not quite as rigid, the way he seemed more present in this dim, quiet kitchen than he ever had in his grand office. They didn't talk much. He asked if the room was comfortable. She said it was too big. He nodded, as if he understood. He asked about her job back in the city. She told him about working at a small plant nursery, about the feel of soil on her hands, the satisfaction of helping things grow. He listened, truly listened, his gaze fixed on her. No one had ever listened to her talk about plants with such intensity. That night became a pattern. Not every night, but often. She would find herself drawn to the kitchen, and more often than not, he would already be there, or he would appear shortly after. The conversations remained hesitant at first, skirting around the edges of their situation, but slowly they began to peel back the layers. She learned that his wealth wasn't inherited. It was built from nothing, a relentless climb from a place of poverty and struggle she could scarcely imagine. He learned that her mother had passed away years ago, and that her relationship with her father, while loving, was strained by his overprotectiveness, a trait that had now reached its terrifying conclusion. One evening, she found him in his study, not working, but simply staring into the cold fireplace. The room was dark, lit only by a single lamp. She hesitated at the door, but he gestured for her to enter. "It was my father's study," he said, his voice low. "He lost everything. This house, it's not just a house. It's a monument, a promise I made to myself that I would never be powerless again." Serena looked around the room, seeing it with new eyes. It wasn't a display of ego. It was a fortress against memory, a bulwark against a past that still haunted him. She saw the loneliness not as a choice, but as a scar. "It must be a heavy promise to carry," she said softly. He turned to look at her, and the raw, unguarded look in his eyes stole her breath. "It is," he admitted, the two words holding a universe of fatigue. The shift was gradual, like the slow turning of the seasons. The guarded looks became lingering glances. The careful distance between them shrank by imperceptible degrees. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, no longer born of fear and anger, but of a magnetic, terrifying attraction. The turning point came on the terrace overlooking the moonlit gardens. The air was warm, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine. They were standing side by side, not speaking, the silence between them now comfortable, charged. Serena shivered slightly in the cool night air. Without a word, Kane shrugged off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was simple, but the intimacy of it was profound. The fine, warm wool carried his scent. Sandalwood, clean linen, and something uniquely, essentially him. As he settled the jacket on her, his fingers brushed against the bare skin of her neck. It was not an accident. A jolt, sharp and electric, passed between them. Serena gasped softly, her head snapping up to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark, intense. The usual cool control replaced by a heat that made her knees feel weak. His hand didn't move away. Instead, his fingers traced a slow, deliberate path from her neck to her shoulder, his touch branding her through the thin fabric of her dress. Time seemed to stop. The world narrowed to the space between their bodies, to the heat of his touch, to the unspoken question hanging in the air. "Serena," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. That was all the invitation he needed, or perhaps it was the surrender he saw in her eyes. He leaned in, his movement slow, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. She rose onto her toes, meeting him halfway. The kiss was not gentle. It was a conflagration. It was weeks of tension, of anger, of curiosity, of burgeoning understanding, all exploding into a single, devastating point of contact. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against him, the hard planes of his body a shocking contrast to her softness. His mouth was demanding, possessive, yet beneath the force, there was a startling reverence, as if he were drinking from a fountain he thought was forever forbidden to him. Serena melted into him, her hands coming up to clutch at his shoulders, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. She kissed him back with a passion she didn't know she possessed, all her fear and frustration transforming into a raw, desperate need. The jacket slipped from her shoulders, forgotten on the stone floor. In that moment, she was not his prisoner. He was not her jailer. They were simply a man and a woman, setting each other ablaze under a blanket of stars. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, they rested their foreheads together. His breath was warm against her lips. The world, with all its complications and dangers, had fallen away. The cage was still there, but the door had been blown wide open, not by force, but by a single, searing kiss. The walls he had built around himself, and the walls he had built around her, had crumbled to dust in the space of a heartbeat. The world did not simply resume after the kiss. It was remade. The very air in the vast, silent estate felt different, charged with a new and terrifying energy. In the days that followed, a delicate, unspoken dance began between Kane and Serena. They were like two celestial bodies, their orbits irrevocably altered, now caught in a slow, inevitable gravitational pull towards one another. The formal dinners in the grand dining room ceased. Now Kane would have a simple meal set in his private sitting room, a space she had never seen, and he would ask David, with a new, unreadable expression, if Serena would care to join him. She always did. Those evenings were a world away from their first strained encounters. They talked. He told her about the early, brutal days of building his company, the nights spent sleeping on a floor in a rented office, the betrayals that had hardened his heart. She told him about her mother's illness, the quiet strength it had demanded, her dream of one day having a small garden of her own. He listened, his gaze fixed on her, as if she were unraveling the mysteries of the universe. He discovered a hunger within himself, not for power or acquisition, but for the sound of her voice, for the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about something she loved. The physical distance between them dissolved with a quiet intensity, a brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a book, the way his fingers would linger on the small of her back as he guided her through a doorway, the heat of his thigh pressed against hers as they sat together on the sofa. reading in a silence that was no longer empty, but thick with anticipation. Every touch was a promise, a reaffirmation of the fire they had ignited on the terrace. Serena, who had never known the touch of a man, found her body awakening to his nearness with a shocking, primal awareness. A flush would creep up her neck when he looked at her a certain way, her breath catching in her throat. She was no longer a girl in a cage, she was a woman on the precipice of a profound discovery, and the man who held the key was the very one who had locked her away. Kane, for his part, was a man possessed. The cold, calculating billionaire was gone, replaced by someone he barely recognized. The relentless drive that had built his empire was now focused on a single, captivating point: her. He found himself thinking of her in the middle of crucial meetings, the memory of her smile derailing his train of thought. The hollow ache that had been his constant companion was now filled with a searing, desperate need. It was more than lust. It was a profound, terrifying need to possess her, not as a belonging, but as a part of himself. He wanted to know the taste of her skin, the sound of her sigh, the feel of her heart beating against his. He wanted to banish every shadow of fear from her eyes and replace it with the certainty of his devotion. The culmination came on a night drenched in the silvery light of a full moon. He led her not to the sitting room, but to his own bedroom. The door closed behind them with a soft, final click. The room was a reflection of him, spare, elegant, powerful. The bed was large and imposing. The moonlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting everything in shades of blue and silver. He didn't speak. He simply turned to her, his eyes blazing with a raw hunger that made her tremble. He reached for her, his hands coming up to cradle her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice ragged, the words a plea and a command all at once. "Tell me now, Serena, or I will not be able to." She looked up at him, at this man who had torn her from her life, who had threatened her, and who had, in doing so, given her a world she had never dreamed existed. She saw the war in his eyes, the fierce desire and the desperate need to protect her, even from himself. She didn't tell him to stop. Instead, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was all the answer he would ever need. It was a surrender and a conquest. His control, so famously ironclad, shattered. He kissed her with a devastating passion that stole the breath from her lungs, his hands moving from her face to tangle in her hair, to sweep down her back, pulling her flush against the hard, unyielding length of his body. The clothes that separated them felt like an intolerable barrier. With trembling fingers, she helped him, fumbling with the buttons of his shirt as he slowly, deliberately, peeled the dress from her shoulders, letting it pool at her feet. In the moonlight, she was a vision of ethereal beauty. He drank in the sight of her, his gaze a physical caress that warmed her skin. He laid her back on the cool, silken sheets of his bed, his body covering hers, not with crushing weight, but with a possessive shelter. He worshipped her with his hands and his mouth, learning the landscape of her body with a patient, agonizing slowness that drove her to the brink of madness. He discovered the sensitive spot at the base of her throat, the curve of her hip that made her gasp, the soft skin of her inner thigh that made her shudder. He was a meticulous, devoted explorer, and she was his newfound world. When he finally, gently joined his body to hers, there was a moment of sharp, startling pain that made her cry out, a sound swallowed by his kiss. He stilled, his entire body rigid with the effort of his restraint, his forehead damp with sweat against hers. "Serena," he breathed, her name a broken prayer. She looked into his eyes, seeing the awe and the torment there, and she knew, with a certainty that shook her soul, that she loved him. She loved this complicated, powerful, broken man. She wrapped her legs around him, drawing him closer, a silent, physical affirmation. The pain receded, replaced by a feeling of such profound fullness, such rightness, that it stole her breath. He began to move, a slow, deep, rhythmic cadence that was more than just a physical act. It was a claiming. It was a promise. It was a conversation without words. a fusion of two lonely souls into one. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the moonlit silence, their hearts beating a frantic, synchronized rhythm against each other's chests. He held her as if she were made of glass, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare back. No words were needed. The intimacy that bloomed in that room was a living, breathing thing, more powerful than any threat or any wall. He had promised she would take every inch of him, and she had. And in doing so, he had given her not just his protection, but his heart, his secrets, his very self. The peace was shattered days later with the violent shriek of the estate's security alarm. It was a sound Serena had never heard, a piercing electronic scream that tore through the illusion of safety. Red lights flashed in the hallways. Kane was out of bed in an instant, his body tensed, his face a mask of cold fury. He shoved a phone into her hand. "Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but me or your father." Before she could protest, he was gone. The sound of shouting and a single, terrifying gunshot from somewhere downstairs froze the blood in her veins. She huddled in the closet, trembling, the phone clutched in her hand, praying for his safety, the taste of his skin still on her lips. The thought of losing him now was an agony far greater than any he had ever inflicted upon her. The chaos subsided as quickly as it had begun. The alarms cut off. The silence that returned was heavy and ominous. Then a firm, familiar knock. "Serena, it's me." She scrambled to unlock the door. Kane stood there, his shirt torn and smudged with dirt, a faint trickle of blood at his temple. But he was whole. His eyes, wild with adrenaline, scanned her, ensuring she was unharmed. The sight of her, safe and terrified for him, broke the last of his restraint. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "It's over," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "They're gone. It's finished." He led her back to the bed, holding her as she trembled. In the quiet aftermath, with the scent of danger still clinging to him, he spoke the words that had been forming in his heart since the moment he first saw her. "I was wrong," he began, his voice low and fervent. "I brought you here to control a threat, to manage a variable. But you were never a variable, Serena. You were the missing piece. This house, all of it, it was just an empty shell. I was an empty shell. You are the light that fills it. I don't want you here as my prisoner. I want you here as my wife, as my partner, as my everything." He looked at her, his soul laid bare. "Stay with me, not because you have to, but because you want to. Be my forever." Tears streamed down Serena's face, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of a love so deep it felt like coming home. She cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle on the cut at his temple. "My forever started the moment I walked into this house," she whispered. "It started with you." 1 year later, the estate was unrecognizable. The cold, formal gardens now boasted a wild, vibrant section filled with the flowers Serena loved. Laughter echoed in the hallways, the sound of a life being fully lived. On a sun-drenched terrace, Kane watched his wife, Serena, tend to a pot of blooming jasmine. She wore a simple sundress, her skin glowing, a contented smile on her face. The ring on her finger was not the largest diamond he could have bought, but it was the one she had chosen, a unique, twisting band that she said reminded her of their path to each other. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He nuzzled her neck, breathing in the scent of her, of jasmine, of home. She leaned back into his embrace with a soft sigh of pure happiness. The billionaire and the bodyguard's daughter were no more. They were simply Kane and Serena. Their love story had begun with a threat, deepened in intimacy, and was now there forever. The cage was gone, and in its place was a world they had built together, a world that was only just beginning. If you've been captivated by the journey of Kane and Serena, from a threatening promise to a passionate and forever love, then you won't want to miss what comes next. Subscribe for more unique, mature romance stories that explore the depths of connection, desire, and the power of finding your other half in the most unexpected places. Your next favorite story is waiting